once you found him, why would you want to go a day without him? Right? 535. Treat today. We were praying for John Rogers and his wife, and particularly for John's health. Well, he's here today, so blessed to have him. We've been supporting him and his wife as a missionary for over a decade. I don't remember when we started, maybe it's been.
Well, it's been quite a while.
10, 12 years.
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, so we've had him speak before, but it's been a little while, so it's good to have him here. And I'm always thrilled to hear not just the Bible, but I'm also thrilled to hear the life lessons that God has taught individuals, which I'm sure he is planning to share that with us today. So without any more introduction, John, with Barnabas Enrichment Ministries, good to have you here today. Why don't you
Thank you.
Bless us with God here today.
Thank you, Pastor. Wow, it's a privilege to be here. If you've been following our newsletters, you know this has been a very unique year. Barnabas Enrichment Ministry. I understand you're studying Barnabas here in Sunday school. I think that's really cool. I can tell you he's one of my favorite characters in the Bible because of the things he did. He cared about others. He put others first. When people were going through difficulty, he helped them. And what was really, hey, Gary, I just realized you're back there. Good to see you, man. When Paul the apostle was first saved, it was Barnabas who took him under his wing and helped him through that some of those very difficult things that took place when he first comes to the Lord, especially when you got a history of chasing and killing Christians. Barnabas had the courage to risk that maybe Paul could have been lying, could have been pretending, all that stuff. And Barnabas risked everything to go ahead and help him develop in ministry, which we're very, very thankful and grateful for. Our ministry travels around and helps small churches. We do it on the road. We do it over phones. We do it through Zoom. We do it all over the place. And the idea behind it is a small church cannot afford help in the same way large churches can. If large churches need counseling service, there's some really big organizations they bring in and pay them to do that. There are all kinds of things that big churches do when they want consultation on how to go into an area and do ministry. Well, Barnabas does that for small churches, and we don't charge for it. We raise our support. We do ask if the church would consider if the Lord would want them to give us something to help us to do the next church. But we don't go with a condition, you got to give us money in order for us to come help you. And so we've been doing that since we've been involved. Bibi and I have been involved since 2011. Been involved in ministry since, 1983. We arrived on the mission field here in Utah and was here for quite a few years. Before that, I had pastored a church and such. So we've been involved in ministry a lot of years. But we love what we get to do with Barnabas. We love coming alongside people and helping them. Well, that's how things work, and it means we are gone like 80% of the year. We are usually gone from our home. And last year was my biggest year. I was scheduled to be gone 95% of the year, traveling, speaking in churches, helping. And then God said, no, I got something else. I came down very, very sick. I was actually driving through Texas on the way to California, and just at the start of the year in January, I think it was actually the last of December, I was heading out there, almost 30th, 31st, somewhere in there. And I had this unbelievable pain. I thought maybe I had a stroke. My whole left side of my body had just gone numb, and I had all this pain. So I went to emergency. They thought it was a stroke. And they came back and said, there's something wrong in your spinal cord. We can't identify what it is. They ran a bunch of tests. And so they strongly urged that I return home. And so I had to cancel that trip. Thought I'd be better. And then one thing led to another. I wound up with an infection. They found an infection in the spinal cord. Somehow it got in there. And it spread to some other parts of the body. And so it's just been a year of every time I go to the doctor, they'd tell me something different was happening. And yet nobody could identify what it was that was causing it. And they now have finally, and actually here just a couple months ago, they were able to identify the major problem that's triggering things. And I'm sharing this ahead of time because I'm going to step into some things that we'll talk about. They found out that I have a collapsed disc. Let me just share this. I've had about 5 surgeries on the neck. I have a collapsed disc. My neck, they said it's aged. It's actually, when I was 45, it was like a 60-year-old neck. It aged prematurely. And so a disc would collapse and cause pain. They'd go in and fix it. Then 2 discs down below would collapse, and then they'd go and fix it in surgery. So I wound up with 5 surgeries. And now they found another disc that had collapsed. But this one collapsed differently. The disc in the spinal column is actually pushing into the main nerve of that runs along your back. And as a result of that, they said, we've got a problem, we can't fix that very easily because it is right next to the heart. And normally, because the way it is, they'd have to do surgery on it. They have to go into the chest, move the heart, and then work on that. And they say there's a high percentage of dying when they do that. So I wasn't really excited about the idea of having the surgery. So we tried other things, and at this point, none of the things have worked. We did some injections in the spinal cord that actually had reactions to. Now, that all sounds terrible and miserable, and I have to say I've learned some adventures about what health is involved this last year. But God has worked through all that, and that's what I want to talk about this morning in our Sunday school hour, that when God, basically I'm going to title this thing, When God Puts You Where You Don't Want to Be. I mean, sometimes God does that. We think about that statement. People say, okay, they're in that problem because they were involved in sin. They were doing things wrong, and therefore there's whatsoever a man sows, that else he shall also reap. So they figure, well, you're going through this because you did this wrong. And you look at, so that happens sometimes. When people do sin, they have bad things happen to them. That's a real reality that goes on. In fact, that was the assumption of a lot of Job's counselor in the book of Job, is that they were assuming that he must have done something wrong for God to allow that stuff to happen to him. So that's one way things happen that we don't like. But there are times when God does things that has nothing to do with whether you've sinned or not, but he has a divine purpose in it. And you're not planning on it. You don't want to do it. With a schedule of 95 being gone 95% of the year last year, went down to not gone at all. No trips were made. And that was something that I would say, man, I don't understand why God's doing that. One of the things that's really great as you start learning from God working in your life is you don't have to understand. I want to talk about it first, and then I'm going to talk about my own personal experience. I want to share a couple of things, a few things in the Bible where God put people where they didn't want to be. Can you think of something? Anybody have any ideas? Place in the Bible where it talks about, yes. Jonah, yeah, he kind of down in the mouth, wasn't he? That kind of a thing. So Jonah got swallowed by a great fish. He didn't want to be there. Any other place in the Bible where God put somebody that, yeah. Joseph, yes, that's a great, we'll talk about him in just a minute. Any other ideas? Somebody? What? Moses, boy, there's a great story there. You know.
Israel didn't want to be in Egypt.
That's right. He sure didn't.
Didn't want to go.
So let's talk about that. Yeah, Pastor.
Paul and Silas and
Yes, Paul and Silas. Boy, you guys have practically taught my lesson already, right here. So that's great. But you're understanding. Those were places those guys didn't want to be, and God put them there with a purpose behind it. The first one I want to talk about, just real briefly, just going to glance through these as we talk about, was the day that Jesus fed the 5,000. There was by the Sea of Galilee, and there was probably, they're estimating, that's 5,000 men, so there's probably at least, potentially maybe 15,000 or more people that were there. And it had been a hard, busy day. When you figure what took place at the end of the day when Christ fed those 5,000, he was actually using the disciples to do it. I think that's always interesting. All these other miracles that Jesus did, a lot of times the disciples watched. But this particular miracle, they got to be a part of it. They had to risk it. When Jesus took the fish and the loaves and divided it, and they're standing there and you think, wow, you want us to go out and feed these people with this? And then they go out there, and then there's food, and there's more fish, there's more bread. So they were learning a lot about trusting the Lord there. In fact, the Bible tells us that God was giving them a chance to learn to trust him. But their hearts were hardened, and they didn't pick up on it. And then the reason was because they're about to be out on the Sea of Galilee. So by the end of the day, Jesus sends the multitudes away, and he tells the disciples to go out in a boat, and he tells them he'll meet them on the other side. And they go out. In fact, Matthew 14:22, it says, and Jesus straightway Jesus constrained the disciples to get into a ship and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. Now, Jesus sends his disciples to go out on the Sea of Galilee, which is a very risky thing. Sea of Galilee sits in the bottom of the valley there, and it's almost like a bowl. If you pour milk into a bowl, all the liquid flows down to the bottom. Well, that's what it is. The air pressure does that. And because of that, coming down upon the Sea of Galilee, it creates sudden storms. You never know when it could be nice weather, and you never know when a storm is going to take place. Well, that's what was happening there. They're out on the sea, and the storm hits. Isn't it interesting? Jesus told them to go there. And I think that's something we want to note. He told them to go to where the storm was. They didn't know the storm was coming. He sets up the circumstances where they're going to be totally dependent on him. And he hasn't told them about that yet. And it says when he sent the multitudes away, he went up into the mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. But the ship now was in the midst of the sea with these disciples, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. And I don't know if you've ever been any place where on a lake or the ocean when the wind's contrary. It can be an amazing experience. And this goes on for hours. It says, and the fourth watch of the night. So we're talking about like 3 a.m. That they've been fighting the storm and trying to survive. What do you think was going through their heads? I know it would have been going through mine. Where's Jesus when you need him? I mean, here we're out here. Why did he send us out here? But as they're doing that, they look up, and what happens? They see Jesus walking toward them. Or actually, he's walking across from them when they first see him. Now, there's nothing in Scripture that said Jesus looked any different. I know there's some paintings of Jesus walking on water. He has this nice halo glow above his head in the paintings, but there's nothing in Scripture that says Jesus looked any different than he did a few hours earlier. But they don't recognize him. They can't fathom it's him. They almost conclude it's a ghost, something supernatural. And you have to pause and say, why? Why didn't they recognize him? I think the answer is kind of almost blows your mind when you think about it. The reason they didn't recognize him is God was doing something they didn't expect. If you were in that boat, what would you be praying? What would you be praying if you were in that boat and in the storm?
Help us out of this.
Get me out of this, right? Yeah. I know the first thing I'd be praying is, God, stop the storm. When we go through difficulties, what's the first thing we pray? God, take this away. And we usually have some pretty good things we tell God why he should do that, right? We have our reasons why we don't want to see that happen. Maybe we're praying, well, if the storm doesn't leave, God, keep the boat afloat. But the one thing they probably weren't praying could you send Jesus walking across the water toward us? God was working in a way they don't expect. And that's one of the things we have to remember. When God puts you in places that you don't want to be, but he puts you there, be confident he's working, and it'll probably be from an angle you don't understand and you don't expect. I love Jesus' statement. In the midst of this raging storm, and they're afraid, he says, be of good cheer and be not afraid. Why would they be afraid? Why would this be a good thing to say to them? Why would Jesus tell them that? They're in the middle of a raging storm. Because God is in control. And that's the thing you have to remember. Every one of these things, and we're just going to mention them briefly here, because we could take a lot of time. Joseph in Egypt, that was brought up. I mean, when you think about it, that story is an amazing story, because Joseph goes out to where his brothers are tending the flocks, and they see him coming, and they plot to kill him. And Reuben finds out, or is there, he comes to understand it, and he convinces them to, well, let's don't kill him, let's put him in a pit, and that way we don't kill our brother. And the thing that's amazing about it is he had plans to go back later and rescue Joseph. But for whatever reason, he left the area. I don't know if he had to go tend some flock or something or other. But when he comes back, he finds out that Joseph has been sold into Egypt. Now, he couldn't rescue him then. Let me ask you to think about something, because here's something we do when we get into situations we don't understand. We look around, and by observation, we make conclusions about what's happening. According to Joseph and what he understood at that moment, when they put him in that pit, there was Reuben there with him, and they were putting him in this pit, and then later on, they pull him out, and they sell him, and he goes down to Egypt. Do you think that maybe Joseph had concluded that Reuben was just as much a part of everything that was happening? He probably did. In fact, he probably doesn't know all the way till when they come to Egypt to buy food and grain. At that time, he hears the story of how Reuben tried to rescue him. They said we should have listened to him. Up to that whole time, all that time in Egypt, it would have been easy for Joseph to have concluded, well, Reuben was just a part of everything else. He didn't want to rescue me either. We have to be careful when we go into circumstances that we don't understand what's happening or why it's happening. We have to be careful we don't make quick conclusions. And we try to rationalize, well, this person did this, and they must have been thinking that. And before you know it, we get angry, we get defensive, when that is not always what's going on. Moses in the desert, talked about him. You know, when he killed the Egyptian, when he went out, he understood that God was going to cause him to lead the people of Israel into safety. And he goes out and he sees this Egyptian being totally brutal, and he kills him in defense of the people, and then the word gets out and he flees for his life. Man, he thought he knew what was going to happen, and he thought he knew the way it was going to happen. And God sends him to a desert, and he winds up spending 40 years in the desert before God tells him this is how we're going to do it. And what's the first thing that he does when God does that? Here he was so enthusiastic. He was ready to do it. He killed the Egyptian, wanted to defend the people. And now he's back in the desert, and 40 years have passed. And God says, now I'm going to send you. And he says, oh, goody, we get to go? That's not what he did. He said, Lord, I can't do this. I'm not good enough. I can't talk very well. I always find it interesting when I read that passage. Moses was amazingly good at explaining why he couldn't talk. And so that's an interesting characteristic that he had then. So God had a plan. And you think about, let me ask you something. Why do you think he didn't want to do it then? He was willing to he wanted to rescue him when he started out, but now he doesn't want to go. Why do you think he doesn't want to go? What? He could be afraid. Yeah, maybe there's a memory there. What? Did somebody say something? Maybe he got comfortable. Maybe he understood what was going on in his life. He understood the flocks. He understood his relatives. He understood his wife. He had all the things. God had brought him, allowed him to be in a place that he could tell you about what life on the desert is like. And now God says, I want you to go. God's changing things on him as he does that. Paul in prison, that was mentioned earlier. Why would God put you in prison when you have a ministry of reaching out to people? We may not be put in prison today, but sometimes we're put in hospitals. We're put in places where we don't want to be. And we think, God, I could serve you better if you didn't do this. Well, here's Paul and Silas. They're in prison there. And there's this earthquake comes. And they could have escaped, and they don't. And as a result, the jailer comes to Christ, gets saved, and even helps, takes care of them, doctors them, something they didn't expect. I think another great prison story is Onesimus, Paul and Onesimus. Onesimus was a slave to Philemon, and he stole from his master and ran off to Rome, and that's terrible. He winds up either in prison or a worker in prison. It's not 100% certain on that, but he winds up in this prison, and there's Paul, and God allows Paul to lead him to the Lord, and he gets saved, and now Paul's sending him back. You know, I'm sure that he didn't want to be in prison, but God had a divine plan that allowed him to come to the Lord. Now, isn't it interesting that God actually dealt this time with a person who had sinned? Onesimus had sinned. He'd robbed. He'd stolen from others. I know there's all kinds of discussion about slavery issues and stuff, but the basic thing is he had stolen from Philemon, and he'd gone off to prison. And when you do that, you know, there's this person doing sin, and God uses it. One of the things that we want to remember, God does not need us to sin to accomplish his purposes. God could accomplish those purposes in Onesimus' life without that. But here's something to never forget, because it's so important. God does not need our sin to accomplish his purposes, but God is very good at using our sin and turning it around and directing it and changing us because of it. What I'm saying to you is, we don't need to sin to have God work, but God doesn't get confused when we do. There's never a time that God says, whoa, I didn't know John was going to do that. What are we going to do now? Man, he's messed everything up, you know. That never happens. That never takes place. So you have that. You have some other examples just mentioned real quickly. Daniel in the lion's den. I'm sure he really didn't want to be there. But God took care of him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. We know those stories. They're real. And you know, we think there was that determined statement by those guys before the king. Now, we will not deny. That doesn't mean there wasn't fear. I'd like to give you a definition of faith, and just remember this one, because this is really has been a help and a support in my life. To define faith, what I believe faith is a decision, not the emotion, but the decision to trust God with what is happening, even though I have all kinds of doubts. You say, well, faith, you can't have doubt. Oh, yeah, you can have doubt. There's fears. You may not understand what's going on. But faith is a decision. I'm going to believe what God says. And I'm going to trust him, not because I have the emotional feeling that he's right, not because I can see and understand how things are going to take place, but because of who he is, because of the quality of who he is, the character of God. Because of that, I can trust him. I can risk him. So faith becomes the decision to trust God no matter how many doubts I have. And that's what you have when you serve the Lord. I want to give you some modern examples. There's a prisoner I met him over when I was speaking in Russia. I was teaching in a Bible institute over there, and I met this gentleman. And it turns out, I found out that this is a story that has happened over and over again in Russia. This isn't just unique to him. It is something that has happened over and over. I've read about other people going through it in prison and stuff. But let me tell you the story that this man told me about him. He was a pastor. He was taken to prison because he was a pastor, and he was beaten every day. Every single day, there was a guard that was assigned to come down and beat him. So every day this guard would come in and would start to beat on him. And after a while, they started to get to know each other because this is something they've seen each other every day. And as they started to get to know each other, the pastor that was the prisoner asked him about his family, asked him what was happening. And you can read this in other stories, but this happened to this particular man. And he says, he told me about his family, and he told me about difficulty, and he said, boy, you really must trust the Lord. And he says, I believe God has a purpose for everything. And this man started bringing his prayer requests to the prisoner every day. He would ask him, could you pray for my son? He's going through a difficult time. Can you pray for my family? And every day he would do that, and then the man would say, well, I've got to beat you now. And he would beat him. And this was going on over and over again. And you think, if you're that prisoner, God, why? Couldn't we do this another way? Why are you allowing this? Don't you think I could have a better chance of reaching more people? But ultimately one day, and this just is amazing. He says, one day the guard walks in and says, I'm not going to be beating you anymore. He said, I've come to trust the Lord by watching your life. They are going to put me in prison tomorrow, and I will be the one that's being beaten. Our lives affect people. God puts us in places we don't understand, we don't make sense to us. We think, wow. And yet God does that. He puts us in those kind of places. I've seen that in my own life. I remember a time traveling out in the jungle in Venezuela and South America. We arrived at an area. I was going up to a village. They had finally translated the book of Ephesians. They were going in this tribal area. They were translating the Bible, and they'd finally got to the book of Ephesians and had translated it into the language of the people there. And they contacted, I knew some people that were involved in this, says, would you consider coming down to South America and come to this village and teach the book of Ephesians? Because this is the first time they're going to be able to read it themselves. And so agreed to do that and went down there. And it was, when we get down on that trip, we were delayed getting to the river. Now you have to understand when we say the river, this is the delta area of Venezuela. If you look at a map, you'll see that the rivers run up toward the northeast of the country, and then it spreads out into a delta, hundreds of miles of little islands scattered all up through there as the water moves out into the ocean, and all looking alike. These guys, the tribal people, know how to get through there during the daytime because they recognize all the different areas. They've learned it. But at nighttime, they don't go at night because it's scary because they can't see. You can get lost out there. And there are a lot of interesting critters out there. There's alligators and such. And, of course, screaming monkeys are really loud. But there are piranha fish in the water. Just all kinds of different things. Well, anyway, we arrived late, and now the people that come to pick us up, to take us into the island where we'll be teaching, they're afraid. They're afraid because we don't know where we're going. We can't see anything. And one of the guys that was with us that we were taking in, he had a camera, one of those old VHS cameras with a bright light. And so he took it and put it on and was able to shine that. We prayed first about what God would do, and this guy thought of this. And by shining the light, he was able to get and identify places. So even though these guys were afraid, and listen, I was afraid too. One of the characteristics of the boats down there was they leaked all the time. I remember sitting down in the boat, and there's water pouring into the boat, coming in through cracks in the boat. And I remember at first I said, doesn't anybody else notice this? Isn't anyone else concerned about the fact that this boat, it's got water pouring down into the center, and it's getting a little puddle down there in the bottom, and it kept pouring in. And then I looked behind me, and there's a guy, one of the tribal people, he had the little 10 horsepower motor, and then there's another guy sitting next to him who was bailing. That's how they went down the river. They bailed water the whole time as they were going down the river. So God has answers, even though we don't have answers on how he does things. I remember up in Fort Yukon, Vivi and I went up there we were up there for 10 weeks, from about the middle of April to the July is what it was. And Fort Yukon is on the Yukon River in Alaska, just above the Arctic Circle. If you go above the Arctic Circle, that means that you have 6 months more of light and then 6 months more of darkness. So when we were up there in June and July, the sun never set. It'd go up to about 10 o'clock in the sky, and then it would circle down right along the horizon and go up. So at 4 o'clock in the middle of the night, it was like in the afternoon. Right, so it was an interesting place to be. But we got there, and it was right at the time when the spring breakup was. And I remember we had Bibi and I prayed, and with some of the other leadership there, that God would allow us to get into the community, that God would cause something to happen, because we were really in a situation where we were the outsiders. How could we be accepted by these people? And we asked God to do that, and we were praying that, and then I get this message that my father had died. It cost thousands of dollars to get in there. We didn't have any backup funds. If I left, I wouldn't be able to come back and finish. And my parents had told me, don't ever leave a mission field if it's going to keep you from serving the Lord if we die. And so I called my brother and sister, and we talked about it, and they said, no, Dad would completely understand you not coming to his funeral. And that was a hard decision. It was a hard one. I wanted to go, but decided to stay because we wouldn't be able to come back financially as far as we could see. And that news got around to the whole village. And I had people coming up with me as I'd walk down the street, and they'd say, why? Why did you stay here? And it allowed openings and to start talking about God. And God brought me here. My parents want me to serve the Lord. My dad would have wanted this. And that was the first thing God did, to open a door where I couldn't see it first. I mean, it was at first you couldn't hardly talk to anybody, but that started happening. And then a terrible thing took place to in the river above the village. A dam formed, an ice dam had formed. And the Yukon River was building up with a 30-mile distance to the back and 8 miles to a river had turned into a lake. And it was behind this ice dam. And everyone was afraid in the village, saying, what are we going to do? They were making plans to get helicopters to get into evacuation, because if this thing broke, there'd be an 8-foot wall of water that would come down the river and would totally bury the village in, they said, about 20 minutes. So how were they going to get people out? And everybody was talking about it. And I remember just becoming really burdened, saying, we need to really pray. And so I asked the church people to let anyone in the village know that we're going to pray that God comes up with an answer for us in this thing. And I remember we had people come, all the people in the church came, but others came. And we prayed that Wednesday night that God would solve the dam problem there. The ice dam that formed would solve that. And there were people saying there's no hope. The next morning, a little crack about that size formed in the dam. And it began to drain. And by the end of the day, it had drained all the water. It broke a little bit at a time. So there was no flooding. We started having people coming to church. We had people coming, meeting with us, and says, your God really knows what he's doing. See, sometimes God puts us in places that we don't understand how we're going to solve the issues around us. We don't know what we're going to do. And God solves it. I remember a time in 2003, I was scheduled to fly back to Russia. And right before I was to go, I came down very sick and was hospitalized because my pancreas had closed off my intestinal system, shut down my entire body. I couldn't eat or anything. They said people normally would die from that, but because they can run tubes into your body, I had tubes all in me. You think of any place in your body, I think there was a tube in that, okay? And they put me in the hospital room. And I was there for 5 weeks. And in that hospital room, it turned out it was a 4-day room, which is kind of strange. On that floor, you only were put in a room for 4 days. If you stayed longer, they'd move you to a longer room on one of the other floors. But for some reason, I was never moved. Nobody could explain why I wasn't moved. So every 4 days, I had a different person in the bed next to me. I had an elderly person who was dying of cancer. I had a young man, teenage man that had leukemia. And just one after another kept being put into that every 4 days. And I'd have a chance to talk about the Lord. You know, as a pastor, I would visit people in hospitals. But there was always one factor when I'd go visit someone in a hospital. I would be walking out at the end of the conversation. I would tell them, the Lord loves you, the Lord cares for you, he's in control. But they're the ones sitting there in that bed. They're the ones that's ill. They're the ones that have all these contraptions attached to them. And I'm telling them to trust the Lord, and then I walk out. Well, there's nothing you can do about it. That's how it is. But now, God puts me in a bed with all this stuff attached to me. And so when I'm sitting there talking about trusting the Lord, I'm in the same position these guys are that are coming in. And just wonderful opportunities to talk about God. Wonderful. We had this young kid, wanted to know how to get saved and prayed. And we had several people come. What I didn't know was we had 2 Christian nurses on that floor. And one day, they'd just taken a person out to move them to another floor. And this nurse comes in and says, "Hang on, I'll get you another one." She'd been feeding them into that bed next to me. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to go through what was going on there. But that's what the Lord was doing. And then we had a nurse come in that had some marriage difficulty. And they said, "I hear you do counseling." And so I wound up counseling. And then I started having 4 or 5 people a day come in and want to talk about how to handle relationship issues. It got spread through the hospital. The head nurse came by and said, "I'm giving you a schedule. You're allowed 3 a day, and that's it." And then I had a doctor come in that was going through marriage difficulty. I'm sharing all that with you because you never know what's going on when God does it. Now I want to take just the next few minutes and talk about this last year. It was a big disappointment not being able to travel and be in the places I thought God was going to put us. But let me tell you some of the things that happened last year. I had opportunities to witness. I probably witnessed more to individuals this last year than I've ever done any other year of my life. The opportunities came from all kinds of different places. To talk with nurses and doctors. I had all kinds of opportunities to share about that. I wound up seeing this one specialist who was a deacon in his church, and they were going through this horrible conflict. And he literally talked to me. I think he examined me for 5 minutes and said, "Here's what we got to do." And then he talked to me for 45 minutes. And said, "How do you deal with this? How am I going to deal with this?" One thing after another like that, over and over. Other patients that were there. I had to take physical therapy. And I wound up one day, as I'm doing physical therapy, I get to meet people that are coming there, and we're visiting and talking. And you get to meet a lot of different people. And so I was able to share about the Lord with a couple of people. Well, one day, my physical therapist said, "I just got a cancellation with the person that's supposed to be after." And another physical therapist guy said, "Yeah, mine canceled too." They said, "Do you have to go anywhere?" I said, "No." He says, "Look, we were wondering if we could have a Bible study. We have a lot of questions. We've been listening to you." And there at that physical therapy place, after our physical therapy, we had a Bible study. And that just opened up all kinds of doors. I would never have talked to these people. I never would have had that opportunity if God hadn't allowed me to become sick. If I hadn't gone through the damage that was in my spinal cord. We had done a lot of counseling by Skype and by phone. I had a counseling situation. Been going on for about 5 years, which I had a young married couple that had separated. He was involved in some pretty bad stuff, and he finally the Lord got a hold of his heart. Now I get a call on the phone, and he says, he's up in Michigan, I'm in Tennessee. He says, can I drive down there? I really need to talk. Can I come down for a couple of days? And so he came down, and we spent 2 days together talking through these things. And now he's trying to rebuild a relationship with his wife, trying to deal with the things, the damage that's done. But that would never have happened, because had I been going where I thought I was supposed to go, had been scheduled, I would have been in California at that time. I would have been available. This is something that's been going on for about 5 years. And now I'm just seeing this young man growing. He's developing in the Lord. But that wouldn't have taken place had I been where I thought I should be. But God put me where he wanted me to be. He knows how to do that. He knows the timing that goes on with it. Something happened this year that I'm just really thrilled to share with you. I think I put it in the newsletter. This year I led 2 of my grandsons to the Lord. Being there, being around them, having time with them. I was able to talk to them about the Lord. It was just really fantastic, which I wouldn't have been home during that time. So what a great privilege that was. I'll tell you one other thing, and then I'm going to run out of time, that I am amazed at. When I was 8 years old, I was really interested in prophecy. And between 8 and 10 years old, I wrote a book about a novel about the Lord coming back. It was a kid's version of everything. As a teenager, I rewrote it and sent it off to some critics who gave me different information. And off and on through my entire life, I have been working on this book, a little here, a little there. And then I've worked on other books that have been published since then. But anyway, at the start of this last year, when I started realizing I'm not going anywhere, I said, why don't I just pull that out? When I don't have anything else I can do that happens, why don't I pull that book out and start working on it? And so I did. And it'd been about, I don't know, maybe 20 years since I'd actually looked at it. And life has a lot of experiences God builds into you. And so I started working on it then, again, and it's finished. It's at the publishers. It's going to be coming out in a month. And I just share that with you because I pretty much concluded I would never finish that book. I didn't have time. But God allowed that to happen. I think what I want to express is when God puts you where you don't want to be rejoicing because he has a purpose in that. You may not see that purpose. You may not understand that purpose. But he has a purpose in it. Listen to this verse in Isaiah 42, verse 16. And I will bring the blind by a way that they know not. I will lead them in paths that they have not known. I will make darkness light before them, and crooked things straight. These things will I do unto them, and not forsake them. You don't have to understand. You don't have to see what's going on. You don't have to see the outcome ahead and be able to tell others about it. But God is in control, and he promises that, and he keeps his word. So whatever's happening in your life, I'm sure there's some things in your life that just don't make sense and you don't understand, and you ask, why does God allow that to be? Don't be discouraged. God knows what he's doing, and he's going to accomplish his purposes, and you can trust him. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the opportunity just to talk about you and what you do despite our understanding, and how you open doors and allow things to take place that we would never have thought possible. God, that's an amazing thing. Father, I ask that you would be with each one here. You know their lives. You know the struggles. You know the challenges that they face and what's going on. I pray you comfort them through your Spirit. Help them to remember that you really are God and that you really do know what you're doing. And none of this is confusing. You have a divine purpose, we pray. Pray this in Christ's name. Amen. All right. Thank you for letting me share that.